A Jewish man walking to synagogue was shot by someone shouting Allahu Akbar in Chicago, the United States. That's what globalizing the Intifada means. This act of terror, in view of the flag of Israel and the US flag, highlights the eighth front from which we are under attack. We know the Jewish state is fighting for its life, as the Iranian regime and its proxies attack across multiple fronts, including Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. But the Jewish people are also under attack around the world. This weekend's anti-Jewish shooting in the US follows an armed man setting fire to a synagogue in France, shooting attacks on synagogues in Russia, shootings in Germany, and shootings at Jewish schools in Canada. Campus tentifadas and protests celebrating Hamas death squads as freedom fighters, and Hezbollah and Houthi rockets as resistance. They all legitimize and encourage murder against Jewish people in Israel and around the world. That's why we must all stand against those who'd like to murder Jewish people in Israel and anywhere they may find them. Did you hear that the foreign ministers of 7 Western countries, Germany, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, issued a statement pressuring Israel to keep working with UNRWA? Why? Because Israel's elected parliamentarians want to formally ban working with UNRWA. The list of problems with UNRWA are too long for one briefing, but here's a fact that doesn't get enough attention. If Hamas is an idea, then UNRWA promotes that idea. It's an obstacle to peace. 90% of Gazan children were educated in UNRWA schools. That means that most of the thousands of Hamas terrorists who invaded Israel on October 7th were educated in UNRWA schools, with Western taxpayer money. Has anyone heard a word from UNRWA teachers who condemned their former students? I haven't. Western governments shutter failing schools at home. Western governments should demand to shutter dangerous schools in Gaza too. They should certainly not pay those schools, with your taxes, to create another generation of rapists and murderers like the October 7th monsters. And Western governments should not demand that Israel help with that insane project. We've been told for a year, Israel cannot defeat Hamas because Hamas is an idea. Well, UNRWA promotes the idea of Hamas. UNRWA is Hamas's UN front group. Billions in UNRWA funds and aid went straight to Hamas. Thousands of UNRWA staff were connected to Hamas. Hundreds of UNRWA staff were hardened Hamas terrorists. A Hamas headquarters was built below and ran power from UNRWA's Gaza headquarters. And UNRWA's teachers ensured that Hamas's ideas live on. UNRWA failed to build peace. That was never its goal. Its goal was to wage a forever war against Israel. Hamas is committed to a forever war against Israel. Hamas promises to do October 7th again and again and again. Defeating Hamas means ending UNRWA's indoctrination of the next generation of Palestinian children so we can have peace. Peace with Gaza requires the 3 Ds. Destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, deradicalize Palestinian society. Do you know where else Hamas likes to work? If you guessed hospitals, right answer. The IDF announced earlier today that 100 Hamas terrorists were caught in a hospital in Gaza, including some who took part in the October 7th massacre. After getting intelligence that terrorists had barricaded themselves inside the Kamal Adwan hospital in northern Gaza, Israel's special forces went in and captured them. Unsurprising for terrorists in a hospital, some of the Hamas terrorists tried to blend in with the civilians Israel was helping to get out of harm's way. An ambulance driver explained, Hamas uses the emergency vehicles to get around instead of them being used to help civilians. He added the staff are sick of Hamas using them. The Hamas terrorists had weapons cache and other terrorist gear stashed in the hospital. During the counter-terror operation, Israel brought in an additional generator to provide electricity and oxygen for the patients. We've seen this story again and again and again in the past year. Hamas turned hospitals in Gaza into military bases. And whatever the World Health Organization tells you, terrorists don't get immunity just because they hide in the basement of a hospital. So what's the response from the World Health Organization? Total silence, as always. We'll take some questions now from the audience watching live on social media. A reminder that you can submit questions wherever you're following.
Thank you, Eylon. There's a headline now that Egypt proposes a 2-day ceasefire for release of 4 hostages. Johnny Miles is asking on our YouTube Live, will Israel accept Egypt's 2-day ceasefire for hostages?
The minister is insisting here in Israel that the negotiations be conducted under fire. What that means is that Israel is open to a pause in the fighting that would enable us to get hostages out, but not to a pause in order to buy time for negotiations. Hamas needs to make a decision. Israel has already put an offer on the table. Hamas terrorists can leave with their hands above their heads, free the hostages, and have their lives. Instead, Hamas terrorists choose to continue abusing the hostages, including a baby. And we need global pressure on Hamas and on its backers, Qatar, Iran, and Turkey, to let the hostages go and to release them so that we can end this war and put this behind us.
How would you assess the role that Qatar has played in the past year in the hostage negotiations?
Qatar's role has not been constructive. Qatar presents itself as a mediator with Hamas, but its role in the negotiations is to act as an intermediary for Hamas. Qatar could end this war tomorrow if it wanted, because Hamas's surviving leaders live in Qatar. All it has to do is threaten Khalid Mashal and the other leaders. We will extradite you to the United States to face justice unless you free the hostages and sign terms of surrender. But they won't do that. And that leads me to conclude that Qatar wants this war to continue, because this war makes Qatar relevant and allows global leaders to go to Qatar and praise it for playing an important role in regional peace. If it wants to start playing an important role in regional peace, it can stop being a safe haven for the terrorist leaders who are holding not only Israeli but also American hostages.
I'm seeing a headline right now that the EU foreign policy chief has called for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon. I'd like to know what you think of that. And also, we have a question on our YouTube Live. Why is the French president pro-Hezbollah?
Israel wants to see a ceasefire in Lebanon, but a ceasefire that keeps Hezbollah away from the northern border. Let's remember the reason that Israel is fighting in Lebanon is because the UN failed, the EU failed, the US failed. The Security Council was meant to help to tell the peacekeepers to help the Lebanese army push Hezbollah away from the northern border. Instead, they allowed it to build a monstrous terrorist army of 200,000 rockets right under their noses, and Israel is now having to deal with the consequences. We want this war to end, but we cannot go back to the world that existed on October 6th. When Hezbollah was planning a massive invasion of Israel, we cannot go back to a world in which they can keep bombing homes in northern Israel whenever they want. So a ceasefire, yes, conditional on Israel's security interests being met so that people can go home. We cannot have a ceasefire that leaves Iran's proxy army stationed on Israel's northern border with no real international plan to push it away.
This is a question from our Instagram Live from Helena, who writes, what are your thoughts on Iranians denying that anything happened when Israel did attack military targets in Iran?
The Israeli retaliation against the Iranian regime was astonishingly successful. People had asked whether Israel could even reach Iran at all, and it showed that it could. It sent 100 fighter jets, they destroyed Iran's aerial defenses, they took out ballistic missile production capabilities. It means that Iran is now going to have to shoot from its own stockpiles, cannot manufacture more rockets, probably can't export them to Russia either, and their airspace has been left exposed should they choose to retaliate. The ball is in their court. Now, it looks like Israel designed its response in a way that would allow Iran to pretend that nothing had happened. That's okay. Israel wanted to send Iran a message of deterrence. That means to prevent the next attack, to tell the Iranian regime there are consequences for attacking Israel, to hold it accountable, and not to let it hide behind its proxy armies. So if the Iranian regime, having suffered such consequences, wants to pretend that nothing has happened because that's how they deal with the embarrassment and climb down from the tree, that's absolutely fine. But everyone understands now that if the Iranian regime chooses to respond, it will be making a very big mistake, because Israel still has a very large target bank that it can now reach now that Iran's anti-aircraft defense systems have been knocked out of action.
This is a question from Alan on our YouTube live stream. How do you de-radicalize a generation in Gaza?
In order to de-radicalize Palestinian society, they need to understand that October 7th was a mistake. For months, every poll showed that a majority of people in Gaza thought that the October 7th massacre was the correct decision by their government, Hamas, despite all the suffering that had happened since. And they thought it was the correct decision because the world told them it was the right decision. When countries like Norway, Ireland, Spain recognize a non-existent Palestinian state, they are telling Palestinians in Gaza, terrorism works, atrocities work, keep raping more Jewish women, abducting more Jewish babies, burning more Jewish families, and we will reward you for your atrocities. They find they get rewarded with more money for UNRWA, and so they say terrorism pays. If we want to de-radicalize Palestinian society, the world needs to make it clear to the Palestinians that there are consequences for such barbarism. They don't get rewarded for it. They get punished for it. It certainly means no more money for UNRWA, the school system that produced most of the October 7th monsters. Because most children in Gaza go through UNRWA schools, that means most of the terrorists are graduates of UNRWA schools. Any school system that produces 3,000 people who invade civilian communities in order to behead, burn, and mutilate people should not be allowed to continue, definitely not with Western taxpayer funding. So if we want to fix the problem of radicalization in Gaza, it means two things. One, international diplomacy must tell Gazans October 7th was a mistake. Two, introducing a new education system that will raise Palestinian children on peace and tell them to embrace a future living next to Israel, instead of telling them that Gaza isn't their real home, they're just refugees, and they should wage a forever war against Israel until it's no more. The way that international diplomats and leaders are acting right now is paving the way to the next October 7th massacre, and they will have blood on their hands for it.
Eylon, this is our last question for today. We've received some questions about your podcast. Could you tell people a little bit about the Peter Berkowitz episode that's coming out this afternoon, why people should watch it, and anything else you want to say about the episodes that you're working on and what you hope to achieve with your podcast?
Thank you for the question. One of our core projects at the Citizen Spokespersons office is the State of a Nation podcast. It's available as a YouTube show and available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. The idea is that you join me behind the scenes for an insider conversation that goes beyond the headlines and between the lines, where I get briefed on what's really happening in the news. Just today, I spoke with Aviva Siegel, a survivor of Hamas captivity whose husband, Keith, is still in captivity, and I was able to ask her about what really happened in Gaza and what really happened in her meetings with world leaders. And today we're launching an episode with Peter Berkowitz. He was a senior State Department official during the Trump administration, during the negotiation of the Abraham Accords. We filmed it on location in Washington, D.C., and had a fascinating conversation about how the people who make foreign policy in the world interpret world events, what lessons they took from October 7th, and how Republicans and Democrats see those events differently, and what might be in store if the Trump administration returns after next week's elections. So I advise everyone, follow, please, State of a Nation on all social media platforms. If you're following on Instagram, it's State of a Pod on Instagram, same on Twitter. Help get our subscriber numbers up and share it. You know, the daily briefings here are where we give you quick updates. State of a Nation is for people who want to really understand more in-depth behind the scenes and want to spend a good hour listening to a quality conversation. So that's all we have time for. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. Israel Standard Time, which is 9 a.m. on the East Coast until Sunday, when the United States also returns to Standard Time. We've moved our clocks back an hour already in Israel. Thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe.